Completing day 3 of JavaScript 30. That's with Wes Boss. And today's activity is to use JavaScript to update CSS variables. So what you'll see on the screen here is this image tag, and I'm going to update the CSS of this image tag by moving these slide bars. And before I do that, I want to point your attention to the variables that are defined down here in the lower right-hand corner. These are the CSS variables, and as I toggle the slide bar, you'll notice not only does the image respond to the change in those CSS variables, you'll notice the the values of those variables updating as I move this slide bar. Now that's happening because in JavaScript I'm using two event listeners at the same time. One that's going to update the CSS with the new value, and one that's going to update values as I move this mouse over the slide bar. Using those two event listeners in conjunction with one another is what allows for the image to update in real time. So let's take a look at the code. First, we're going to start with the HTML, and we're going to look at this label and input tag. The input is going to be of a type range, which creates the slide bar, and I'm going to provide that with a certain min and max to provide endpoints for the value. But two things I want to point out in particular are the name and the data sizing. So this data sizing is a custom HTML attribute that you can create using the word data dash and then whatever word you want to follow that up with. In this case, it's going to be sizing to refer to the suffix of the CSS variable value. So in this instance, I'm going to be changing the translate, which is going to take pixels. So we'll see later in the JavaScript that I'm essentially going to send this giant string that's going to contain the new value and, if necessary, the suffix associated with that value. So in this case, for translate, I'm going to be sending whatever the value is that the user set it to, along with this pixels suffix. The second thing I want to point out is the name, and this name is going to correlate with the CSS variable that I'll show you in just a second. So again, when I send that big string using JavaScript, it's going to basically take the name of this label and the value along with the suffix, and then that is what's going to end up changing the CSS variable. Let's take a look at what those variables look like. So you're going to define these variables up in the root. That way they will be available to any of the HTML elements located lower in the tree. Since the root is going to be the highest, this is in effect going to make these variables available to any HTML element that you have. And for this example, I went ahead and applied those variables to the image tag. So instead of defining the opacity as, say, like 0.01 or translating with a certain number of pixels or rotating with a certain number of degrees, instead I'm going to pass along this root variable. That way, when the JavaScript updates the value of the variable, the values that are located in this image tag are going to update as well. That's kind of what we saw in the lower right-hand corner of the screen in the DevTools. And then finally, the JavaScript, where the first thing I had to do was grab all of the inputs located within the controls class, and then add the two event listeners. Just one more time, what using these two event listeners at the same time does is allow for the user to see their effect on the image while the user is moving that slide bar. If I didn't use them both at the same time, the CSS variables would still update, but you wouldn't be able to see that image change while I'm moving the slide bar. So using them together kind of creates a cool little effect for the user. Now for the function, I'm going to grab that suffix if there is one. If not, I want to make sure I return an empty string. If I didn't specify the empty string, I'm actually going to send undefined within the string, and that's not going to be any good. So you want to make sure you either grab the suffix from the dataset if it exists, or pass an empty string. There's a little bit of arithmetic I had to do here, considering the value for opacity is actually going to be a decimal point, so I needed to make sure I was sending it a decimal point instead of a whole number. But in either case, on either one of the if or the else statement, what I'm going to do is grab whatever element that event listener is being triggered from, Then I'm going to locate its CSS and then add this property using set property. And I'm going to then take the name from the HTML tag and then the value along with the suffix that I grabbed from dataset. And this is that big string essentially that I was telling you about. And when I run this function, those CSS variables are going to update. Thank you.